Hi everyone, welcome back to our Maine Homestead. Today I want to share with you how I handle my worm farm, my little setup, especially my wintertime setup, and just kind of walk you through some of the things that I've learned. I've been doing this since we moved here, so this is the 6th winter we've been here, and so I've learned a little bit. I don't know it all, but I know enough that they're still alive. I guess that's all that matters. So I'll kind of show you my setup and tell you some of the things that I've kind of figured out that are, most of them are kind of basic, but a few things that I've learned about my setup in particular that are very interesting. So I'm down in the basement of Francesca. She's standing off camera. Oh, there she is. Down in the basement, we kind of moved in and took over the basement since we started building our house, and well, since it got cold toward the end of building season. But here are my plant starts. We did just recently have done a starting plant video, or started it. We've got some things sprouting, and we're going to wait kind of till things sprout up in these trays before we kind of finish that video, but that'll be coming up in the next few weeks. But I want to show you our worm farm. So this is kind of the only active stage of the worm farm right now. But I want to show you, I've just started harvesting some castings. So I'll show you kind of what I harvested and explain how that worked to you. So this is the tub I was talking about. That's the main tub that is active right now. And I'll kind of try to explain what that means. I'll go over here. And here's the tub that contains what I've just harvested. And these are what we're about to feed the worms. We kind of collect all of our kitchen scraps and chop them up, small-ish pieces before we feed the worms. And typically we only feed our worms about every 2 weeks. And they seem to be thriving with that and multiplying like crazy. So I keep the lid on this. There may be a worm or two in here. As soon as you take the lid off, they scatter or bury themselves. But I don't know if you can tell, this is like, it's moist right now, but it's super rich. There's a worm, so we'll throw that back in with the others. But for the most part, all of these worms, all of the worms that were in here, and this was full of all of our worms at one point, all of them migrated into that bucket. So what happened, I'll try to explain it to you, and I'll show you kind of how we layer our worms. Let me throw this little guy in here. He'll find his way down to where he should be. So this was my original tub. For now, there are no holes in the bottom. This is a solid bottom tub. So I'll show you the process that we did to start a worm farm, and then to feed and add bedding to it each time we feed, like I said, every 2 weeks. But let's start at the end, and then we'll work our way back to the beginning, I guess. So this, when we started this, and once it filled up and got to this point, basically, it's full of worms. And you don't want to try to sift through all of this and get out all the worms. You're going to end up with hands a million times dirtier than this, and you'll never get all the worms out of there. You saw I just pulled one out. There's not very many in there, and I'll kind of try to explain why. So once this kind of got about a third full, and I was ready to harvest this, which is pure worm casting. So this is all basically worm poop. Once it got to the point to where I was ready to harvest it, all I did is take another tub the same size. I drilled holes in the bottom of this tub, and then I still have like air holes in the side so that they can get oxygen and be able to breathe, and you can keep a lid on it, because if worms like it to be really dark, so you want to keep a lid on it, but they've got to breathe as well, so you have to have air holes all the way around. And you don't have to have a ton of them, just enough so that air circulates kind of in there. But anyway, this tub has holes drilled into the bottom on the underside. I could probably show you that. Yeah. So holes drilled all in the underside. So I've got a solid tub here that's basically looking like this at the point of where we're ready to do what I'm about to describe. But that's where all our worms are. All of our worms and all of our good stuff is in this tub. So all I did is drill holes in the bottom of this tub and then put bedding, and I'm going to show you how I make bedding and how I do that. I put bedding and a little bit of dirt, just kind of sprinkle it around so there's some grit in there, kind of like grit for chickens. Worms need to have grit, part of their digestive system from what I understand. So there's holes in the bottom of this. Put a little bit of bedding, a little bit of grit, sit it down inside this tub, put the top on it, and wait about 2 months. Obviously the whole time, about every 2 weeks for us, feeding. So adding a layer of food and then covering that with a layer of moist bedding. And in about 2 months, all of the worms migrated from this tub up through the holes into this tub, which is now separated from that tub, obviously. And all the worms are in this tub now that we've been feeding and adding new bedding to every 2 weeks. And all the worms are in this tub now, and they're currently making new worm castings or new compost. So I'll just show you kind of what this tub looks like before we add bedding and food. So you can see some of these long things. These are potato sprouts. There's some potatoes under there somewhere. But all this is just shredded paper that's moistened to give it a good consistency. You don't want it wringing wet. You don't want to squeeze it and water drip out. But you see I squeezed it and it stuck together like in a form of my fingers wrapped around paper. That's kind of the consistency you want. So I'll dig under here. Hopefully you can see this. But you can see there's worms. Tons of worms, and they're reproducing constantly. There's some up on the sides of this tub, but I don't have any escaping, so it must be a good environment. And then you can see there's still some food scraps. Looks like a piece of potato there. But this is kind of halfway composted shredded paper. So side by side you can see this is kind of was added about 2 weeks ago. That I just dropped, and this has been in there who knows how long, but I would say probably month and a half, and it's starting to look like soil, but it still has somewhat of an appearance of shredded paper that's being degraded, which is exactly what it's doing. So I'll cover them back up. But you can kind of see the process where all it's doing is composting, and the worms are taking care of that for you. And it's a very simple process. So let me show you how I would start a worm bed, and also how you would feed and the worms and put new bedding in there. It's basically the same, very simple, straightforward, easy to do, and this video takes way longer than it would take to actually do it every 2 weeks. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and feed them. I'm going to put it on top of what you just saw, which is the medium degraded shredded paper. And all we really feed are vegetables. So like leftover vegetables that may be starting to get soft, spoiled, that kind of thing. You don't want to feed your worms meat. They don't typically like anything spicy, so we don't put peppers or things like that in there. You don't put any dairy products in there, and that's just us. I'm not saying that's a hard and fast rule, but the three I mentioned are pretty standard. I think no one feeds their worms those kind of things. But you can see what this looks like. It's, just chopped up like you would put it on your salad. So we're making a worm salad. And all we're gonna do, very simple again, is just kind of relatively evenly spread this out. So we'll say a couple of things I've learned. So I try to get the bedding consistently moist like I showed you, so that it molds into a form, but you don't wring water out of it. If you wring water out of it, it's probably too wet. So if you get it too wet down in here, you don't have to pick up handful by handful and wring each one out into a tub. I'm joking. But you can just add more dry bedding and it will saturate itself and balance itself out. But you can see this is starting to get rotten basically. So I'll just take this and kind of spread it evenly in here. So a couple of things I've learned. Number one, you see there's a little moisture in there. That's not going to hurt anything. If you have this sitting on the kitchen counter, if it's maybe summertime, too warm in there, or you just let it sit, the vegetables sit in there for longer than you planned, you might end up with sometimes an inch of fluid where the vegetables have rotted. I don't pour that in there. That might make it too moist. It probably won't hurt anything, but if you don't need that extra moisture, don't add a ton of extra moisture to it. One thing I have learned, if it gets too moist, which I have done that, not in this setup, but in my previous setup, if it gets too moist, the worms start leaving and they'll try to escape. That's when you start having them leave. So if you can keep the environment and conditions kind of optimal for them inside here, they'll be happy, you'll be happy, because you won't have worms crawling through holes and worms out in the floor when you wake up in the morning. So that's one thing. This bin right now is not quite half full. You could bring it all the way up to maybe 3/4 full if you wanted to, but that's just going to take longer for the worms to migrate up through the holes of the next bin and you to be able to use this. So you can kind of manage how much you want to put in here and how long you wait to harvest this based on when do you need the soil. So we just started plants. I didn't use any of this over here in this, but I'm about to mix some of this in with potting soil to give it some better fortification, more energy. And then I'll use this for potting some like herbs or starting some bigger plants in the 3-inch pots. I don't need any more than this right now. So this, I probably won't use any of this until possibly fall that's in this container. Possibly fall, maybe not even till next spring. It just kind of depends. We're not growing a lot this summer, so we're not going to use near as much as we typically do. One thing I will share, you saw this, and it's about 1/3 to 1/2 full in that tub. That's all from just doing what I've done here for about 4 months, 3 to 4 months. So, and that's starting with, I think we started with 1 pound of worms in this setup, roughly. So a pound of a bunch of worms that would fit like this, and they make probably 2-3 pounds a month of what they'll produce of worm castings. If you don't know much about worm castings, Google it, whatever. That stuff is like, it's like a superfood for plants, so it's really good. So I fed them. Now I'm going to add some shredded paper bedding to the top, moisten it down, put the top back on it, and we're done. Paper towel rolls, toilet paper rolls, anything like that. So, sure I'll get some comments on this. You really should try to use, as much as you can, black and white print. I hear people say, oh, the color's not good for them. Obviously, any dye is not something you want to ingest, but I'm not eating the dirt. I'm using it to grow my plants. Still not ideal, but this is just a great source that I have. Once I read these, I might as well reuse them, so I'm repurposing them. So ideally, it's black and white, not with a lot of color. And this doesn't, most of these pages don't have a ton of color, but they've got probably too much. Anyway, all I do is run them through. So again, about 4 or 5 of these is enough to put plenty of bedding on top. What you want to do, and this is another kind of tip, I guess, you want to be sure the worms are covered and all the food is covered. If you put the food on top and don't cover it up, you're going to end up with fruit flies, maybe some other types of bugs that I have no idea what they are, but I've seen them before. But also you're going to get more of an odor. When I opened the container to feed them, it smelled like rotting vegetables. You know, not horribly strong, not like an outhouse kind of smell or anything, but still it had an odor to it. Once you put the paper on top of that and moisten it, you will not notice any odor at all. And of course the worms will be happy because they don't like light. The paper kind of covers them up and gives them a dark environment, and it also kind of inhibits the smell from coming out the little air holes that I drilled in the side of that tub. So I'll show you now what size I use. You can do this with scissors. I've done that. I did that for several years, but you could kind of tell this maybe from where I showed you the moistened paper, but that's what it looks like before you moisten it. So it's just small, kind of maybe 1/4 inch, 3/8 inch strips, short 1.5 inches or so. I will fill this up with, it'll take about, like I said, 4 or 5 of those little booklets that I'm shredding. I'll dump it in there and we'll moisten it. I'll show you that. So I've learned, a couple of more things I've learned. Number one, kind of like with seed starting mix, soil, really fine soil, if you don't wet it first, there's not enough surface tension. So then when you start pouring larger quantities of water to try to wet your seed starting mix, it spreads it out. It'll hit it and open it up, or just move it around a lot. It creates divots, that kind of thing, and it won't soak into the soil as well. Same thing with this, although there's not really a solid surface. If you don't spray it with water first before you start pouring this on here, typically it'll just go right through. But if there's some water for it to kind of stick to, then you end up allowing it to sit on the paper a little bit, and it'll end up getting moist a lot easier. And again, it may look like I'm putting a lot of water in here, but it's not very much. This is a spray bottle and it was already probably right here, so I haven't put much water at all. I just put my finger over it and kind of sling it, and I'll show you that the underside of this is going to be not wet at all. There'll be most of the paper underneath this top layer is dry. You also saw that when I put the shredded paper in here, it was up to about this height, so it looks like it's full within a day or so, especially after you wet it. But once it sits in here and the worms start moving up into this area, it will shrink down a lot. It will not. It might be an inch above the previous level. That's why using these tubs is a great idea, because you've got a ton of volume. You saw how much soil, about half of a tub of soil, and I could have kept going further up potentially. And a very easy system. I'm kind of a purist and I want to do things all natural. I built wooden boxes and put hardware cloth on the bottom of them, and then I lined them with shredded paper on the bottom, moistened it, then I started feeding on top of that. It worked great, but it's very hard to seal in and contain all of the liquid, because sometimes you will end up with a layer of liquid on the bottom, and of course then that drains out if it's not a solid surface or not sealed very well. So even though this isn't like the traditional way of doing it, it's a very easy way. You can buy these tubs at Walmart for $5 or $6. You can, for $12 and some worms and a paper source and your leftover vegetables, you can like supercharge your garden with soil like that. So I don't put a ton of water on here all at once. I go in very slow, but you can see what I'm probably see how dry that is. So then take it and just kind of toss it. Oops, try not to make a big mess like I did. But all you're doing is just kind of moving some of that moist paper down to the bottom. The other thing I've learned, trying to do things more time effective and not trying to get it just perfect. It's hard for me sometimes, but you don't have to do this all in one day. If it's a little dry one day, the next day you come back and do this again, and it'll be, you know, after a couple, maybe sometimes 3 days. Just don't be in a hurry to get it all moistened. Just like with anything, and that's the end of that bottle, but just like with anything you're trying to moisten, the moisture is going to move to where it's not. So if there's a very moist area here, it's going to soak into that paper and wick its way across the tub. So you don't have to try to get it perfectly moist. But you can see I got a little bit of paper on my hand. If you tried to moisten the paper first before you put it in there, you're going to end up with big clumps and you're going to be covered in wet paper that's sticking to you everywhere. It's just a huge mess. This is way easier. Refill my water bottle, well, Francesca did. So I'll add some more water to this and get it to close to the right consistency. And again, I'll check it over the next day or two and just get it to the right point. And then it's easy to maintain. And typically between the every 2 week feedings, I might spray it once if I look and see that it needs it. But a lot of times you don't even have to spray it. If you get it right to start with, keep the lid on it, then it'll maintain that moisture. Obviously the worms are moist, there's moisture in the scraps that you're feeding, so you really don't have to do a whole lot of maintenance. That's the other great thing about this system. Even though there's the air holes on the side, putting the lid back on it, which you do want to do because again the worms don't like light, you want to keep it dark in there. Putting the lid back on it helps keep that moisture in as well. So I will come back and finish that, but to wrap things up, I was going to say, so where do you get worms from? I have ordered them from a place, I think it's called Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. You've probably heard of it. It's probably the most popular, like well-known place to order worms. There's a ton of them online, like anything. You can look. But these I actually ordered because they were much cheaper. Just say that. Ordered them from someplace on Amazon. So it's been over a year since I ordered this batch, so I really don't know. And as you know, in a year the prices could have changed dramatically. You know what happens on Amazon. One place is doing well, so they up the prices because they're getting a lot of business flow, and then so there's always someone cheaper, seems like. Anyway, so I would look on Amazon or just Google, general Google search, and some things will pop up. Amazon or maybe even eBay. You know, I read reviews, I do research before I buy anything, so I feel comfortable buying it. Doesn't mean it's going to work out. So the other thing is, what do you do with the worm castings once you're done? So there's several things. I mentioned one of the things I do is I mix this in, and you just kind of mix it to get the right consistency. It seems like typically I would use 50-50 mix, but you can mix it in to start plants that are going to stay in one pot for a long period of time. Like if you're starting most herbs, I start them in 3-inch pots, not in these little small 1-inch cells that are in the big 10-20 trays. I'll start them in 3-inch pots because they're going to stay in that pot for a long time. Things like tomatoes, I'm going to transplant several times, so I don't start them in bigger pots. I start them in smaller and gradually work my way up. So mix it 50-50-ish, or just kind of feel what the consistency feels like into whatever you're going to plant in. You can also use it just as a fertilizer, so you can top dress in an existing bed or an existing pot. So you say you have a potted plant, a house plant, and you want to fertilize it. If you want something all natural, worm castings are great. So you can just kind of brush aside the top layers of soil, sprinkle some of the straight worm castings on the top, cover them back up, water it, and that will permeate the soil and give you some really good fertilizer. The other thing you can do, which is real interesting, and I have done this, and it works incredible in my experience. What I've used it for mainly is to rejuvenate soil. So I use potting soil that I've had for several years. I just kind of try to give it an energy boost before I use it. Make worm tea. So you can take some of the worm castings if you don't have liquid or you're not catching liquid, and I'll share that in a second. But the worm castings, you can take them and just basically steep them in hot water and allow that to turn into a tea. And then that, I usually do it in a gallon jug. I don't have any idea how much exactly you would put in there. But if you put a handful of worm castings into a gallon jug, fill it up with warm water and let it sit for a week, 10 days, whatever, until it kind of turns into a dark, like liquid, that's a super fertilizer. And then you've got a jug of liquid fertilizer. Now, depending on how much you use, I'll use maybe that much in a gallon, fill it with warm water, and then typically I'll dilute it 2 to 1. So I'm obviously not using the full strength stuff, but that's still got tons of fertilizer in it. But I would not say use it full strength, but you may be able to do that with mature plants. I'm using it more on younger plants. I rarely fertilize my adult plants that I'm growing in the garden kind of thing. And I know that's counterintuitive, but I try to start off with really good soil to start with, so I don't fertilize through the year. And then at the end of the year, I fertilize or kind of rejuvenate the soil, let it sit, and then in the spring it's ready to go again. So last but not least, with holes in the bottom of your tub that you allowed the worms to migrate up into, if you take this lid, flip it over, it's basically, you've got a catch area to catch liquid. So if you're getting your bedding too moist, or over time some liquid may seep down, but typically it's because there's too much moisture. If you want to be, especially if you're starting out and trying to figure out how much is enough moisture, you can just take this, flip it over, sit your tub on top of it, there's holes in the bottom, and then the liquid has a place to go and you can catch that. That's basically worm tea. So maybe you save a step if you do that. Anyway, you'd have to have another lid. I don't have one because I keep that one covered to keep the moisture in. This one stays on top to keep the light out and the worms in. So that's it. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. And coming up, we'll give you an update on the seed starting, or it'll be a seed starting video for this year, but we'll kind of show you how that's going up to that point.